Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I have Justin from Deconstruction Zone. We're going to be tackling full preterism today. What's up, Justin?
Derek, I'm glad to be here. I don't think you and I got to do any stuff on preterism yet, and I know you've been deep in preterism.
Yeah, I used to be one. I used to believe that all prophecy was fulfilled in the first century. Come on, you're a Christian, and when you hear that message that, there's a problem where a lot of skeptics say, hey, there's some predictions here that didn't happen. And he seemed to expect them to happen soon. Right. And then there's a solution to that problem. It did happen. Well, you're going to follow the words of Jesus. He said it would happen soon. He can't be wrong. Therefore, they happened soon. And I just did. That's what I did. And I ended up going down the full preterist route. Before we continue that, though, I do want to share your YouTube channel real quick. I know that you have the debate channel too. Is this at the bottom of, I don't know.
So I've got my debate channel in my links. So Deconstruction Zone is still my main channel. I still do live streaming from Deconstruction Zone. I started a debates only channel because, there's a lot of people that just want the debates. Like they don't care about the educational content or the interviews. Like they just want to see the debate content. So I've got a channel just for that now. If all you want to do is see someone get cooked, that's the channel.
People like watching people get cooked. It's
really do.
It's just a great day to be alive, man. So you're known, if I could say, not only for debates online, but also for understanding Hebrew Bible prophecy or even just Hebrew Bible scripture within its original context. And you use this often to kind of show that Christians are just making up stuff. And that to me is a very interesting angle, which it always, they have a double fulfillment. They find a way to make it make sense. So I figured, man, who better than to talk about full preterism, where words stop meaning words, in my opinion. And if you do want to say that's what they mean, then they didn't do anything. It's just, there's like problem after problem. So where do you want to begin?
So first of all, I agree with you. I think preterism's their main trick, the one trick pony, is that they give you a whole spreadsheet of words that no longer mean what you would think they mean. And they all have alternative meanings. So the whole game is a big old switcheroo of, well, life doesn't mean life anymore. Heaven and earth doesn't mean heaven and earth anymore. Resurrection, like the body isn't the body anymore. Like there's so many things. Like you just have to have a whole new dictionary to be a preterist. And the reality is, if you're the audience and you're listening to these words from Jesus, or you're reading Paul's letters, or you're reading the prophecies of the Old Testament, you would never get this idea. This is something that's cooked up 2,000 years later to cope with the reality that prophecies just didn't come true. But anyways, I think a good place to start is maybe we'll start in familiar territory to preterists. We'll start with Revelation and maybe the bodily resurrection. I think if I'm reading the New Testament, especially if, let's say I'm a Messianic Jew and I've adopted the Christian message, right?
Right.
I'm expecting a bodily resurrection, and I'm expecting Jesus to come back in a bodily form. Acts chapter 1 says, men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up towards heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come the same way as you saw him go into heaven. So when Jesus comes back, I'm expecting him to come back in a bodily form. I'm not expecting a bunch of cloud formations to form and then a temple getting destroyed. That's just not what we're told to expect. And Paul said that even when he ascended in 1 Corinthians 15, that he had a body. It's a spiritual body. It's a glorified body. It's different than the body he was killed in. but it is still a body. We expect to see a visible body. We saw him rise. We should see him come back. As a Jewish person, this would make sense because we expect the resurrection to be a bodily resurrection. So we can go a little bit into the bodily resurrection. I think the case that we want to use for that, we can find in Revelation, we can find elsewhere in the Old Testament. But before we do that, let's touch on Revelation. Revelation is going to lead into this idea of the resurrection. In fact, you famously studied Revelation. We've got two resurrections in the book of Revelation, the first and the second, right? But it certainly seems to be that both of them include the body. But let's talk about Revelation first, which is, I think the Achilles heel, in my personal opinion, has always been the dating of Revelation.
Okay.
So
let's do it.
If you've got a book of prophetic utterances that post-date 70 AD, because the hallmark of full preterism is that everything was completed in 70 AD. There's a couple branches that say, well, everything was completed and the 1,000-year reign started in 70 AD, and then it ended in 1070. You can go that route. I don't know a lot of preterists that do that, only a couple.
Not the ones I engaged with. They just made 1,000 not mean 1,000, but we'll get to that.
Right. right. Well, there's a whole nonsensical talking point about how Gog and Magog are actually the Turks, and that 1,000 years later, after the temple was destroyed, we had the Crusades and we dealt with the Turks, and therefore that is the end of the 1,000-year reign with Gog and Magog. There's a whole thing there, but either way, if even parts of Revelation, not the whole book, because personally, I don't know if the entire book post-date 70, but even if only part of it post-date 70, it'd be really difficult to see how these prophecies were fulfilled prior to 70. The first line of evidence I would go down is probably that just about everything, like there's a bunch of stuff in Revelation that appears to be written during the reign of Domitian. Like we just got a lot of stuff that lines up with that. And it doesn't seem to line up with like the time of Nero, even though Nero is kind of a hallmark character classically in chapter 13 in the Mark of the Beast. We have a Nero interpretation. But even the church fathers, and I know preterists probably don't care about the church fathers, but the church fathers understood typically Revelation to have been written during the reign of Domitian. For example, Irenaeus says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist." So he's saying we're not going to guess who the name of the Antichrist is, for if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who held the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long ago, almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. So Irenaeus is saying, like, we don't know who the Antichrist is. It could be here now. It's not for us to guess. Either way, the prophecy that John gave us was just a little bit ago in Domitian's reign. Clement of Alexandria said that it was written while John was on the island of Patmos, exiled or banished by the tyrant, which is typically a reference to Domitian. And Victorinus in the 3rd century explicitly states that John was on the island of Patmos, condemned to mine by Caesar Domitian. Eusebius, a trusted historian of the Christian church, says the same thing, that John was exiled under Domitian and then returned at the end of Domitian's reign. So the early church seems to be of the opinion, and the book itself seems to agree, that almost all of it, or at least part of it, was penned after the reign of Nero, during the reign of Domitian. Domitian would have been the early 80s into the 90s. And then we have, obviously, there's going to be people push back. Well, if Nero is the Antichrist, then obviously it must have been written prior to 70, but that's not the case. The fever pitch of Nero Redivivus that we see hinted at in Revelation 13, that reached a pinnacle in the 80s.
And it went into the 2nd century even. I mean, this was like a centuries old idea.
It certainly was. The Sibylline oracles mention it well after 70. The most famous Nero imposter, the one that nearly caused a cataclysmic war between the Parthians and the Romans. We're not told if there was an actual rebellion under this leader or if he was kicked out before the rebellion started.
Right.
But that was in 88 CE, in the middle of the reign of Domitian. So we know for sure that even during the reign of Domitian, this idea of Nero Redivivus was at large. It was reaching the pinnacle of success. So no wonder if it was written, if Revelation was penned during the reign of Domitian, obviously such a legend would be featured within the text. Also, like when we talk about what's happening with the churches, it seems to mirror what we would expect during the reign of Domitian. Like it talks about famously the Laodicean church. It talks about, they get chastised because you're rich, we don't need anything. This seems to be a reference to the fact that after the earthquake in 60, they refused Rome's money. And we're like, no, we can rebuild. We don't need your money. We're well off, right? But the reality was, it took well over a decade to rebuild. They were in ruins for a long time. I think it would be unexpected for the Laodicean church to be in a situation where they were rebuilt, they were well off, they were not in need, and they had already reestablished the region. When just a little bit ago, they were annihilated. They were rebuilding the city all the way into the 90s. It took a long time to rebuild that place. So it seems to be that if in fact the Laodicean church had been rebuilt, restored, and the city was prosperous, it must have been sometime after the earthquake in 60-61. There's other clues as well. Like so for example, the persecutions of the church at large didn't really happen under Nero. This didn't happen until after Nero was already gone. Nero died in 68 famously. So any large scale persecution of the church, we would have to say was post-dating 70 most likely, especially because Nero famously really only persecuted the Jews that were at the epicenter. And even that can be a little bit in doubt as to the extent of his persecution. Some people doubt the claims of like how extensive the persecution was. So I say all that to say this: there's a lot of stuff in Revelation, and scholarly consensus puts it in the late 80s, early 90s. There's a lot of stuff in Revelation that would lead one to believe that it just wasn't written prior to 70. And if Revelation wasn't written prior to 70, I just can't see how the claim that all prophecies of the Bible were fulfilled before 70 when we didn't have all the prophecies yet.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I know that I came out of the Kenneth Gentry kind of background where you made this case that it had to be 70 AD or before that the book of John or the Apocalypse of John was written. And there was a lot of evidence that even if we granted that, we still have a problem. Because you're looking at like Revelation 18. This is why they wiggle around. They go to Revelation 11 and they say, hey, the city, the great city where, I mentioned this on the call before we started, where our Lord was crucified, that's Jerusalem, duh. And it's called a great city. And so they just do this, like, there's a common thing Christians do. They find a word, they jump to another place where they find a word, and they go, well, this must be that same thing, right? And I think you got to be extremely nuanced when you do that, because how many great cities were there in the Bible?
Right.
You have Assyria, you have Egypt. And I mean, we're talking Old Testament, because of all the books in the New Testament that quotes the Hebrew scriptures, none does it more prevalent than the book, the Apocalypse of John. And you're seeing this great city in Revelation 11, and then they go to Revelation 18. This doesn't encompass everything they try to argue, but Mystery Babylon, they try to make that Jerusalem. And there's already a description for that great city that's in Revelation 11 as Sodom and Egypt. So, okay, they're called Sodom and Egypt. Oh, and they're Mystery Babylon. What else are they? Like, are they the Parthians now? Like, what are you going to add? What other name do we want to give this single city? So we know from other First Peter talks about where Peter says that he's in Babylon. We know Rome was equated with Babylon. The Sibylline Oracles talks about this. And so there's this destruction that's supposed to come to the new Babylon, this Mystery Babylon, the whore Babylon. And they don't like that, because if that's true, just like your dating issue, if it's true that Mystery Babylon is Babylon, the woman seated on the 7 hills, which we have a coin from 71 AD with a woman sitting on 7 damn hills.
I know, it's not Jerusalem, it's Rome.
It's Rome, dude. Like, and once you see that there's a woman sitting on 7 hills, a female goddess at that, who represents Rome. I believe it's Nike or something. I can't remember. All I know is this represents Rome. It may be a different goddess, but you're literally just grasping at straws at this point, because if that is true, and it seems obvious that is, then Rome didn't get destroyed in that first century. And of course, then the next escape for some forms of preterism, which isn't the common full preterist view, is that, well, gradually over 300-400 years, the miracle happened. The prophecy happened. And it's like anything can happen over 300-400 years. But that's one of the things that they might try to do, is typically say that's Jerusalem. They don't want to allow that to be Rome, you know?
Which is, like, even if you've only read Revelation for the very first time, you know that Rome is Babylon. That, like, the enemy of God's people is personified as Babylon, but we know that it's Rome. We know Rome is the enemy.
Right.
And famously, you know, in the first chapter of Luke, what does Luke say? Luke says that Jesus was born to deliver them from the hands of their enemies, plural. Not the hands of Satan, the hands of their enemies, so that they can live in peace. They have an enemy. That enemy is Rome. That's their enemy right now.
I actually found the coin. If it's cool to pop this up,
definitely do.
Just because I can already hear the screamers. By the way, thank you, Marilyn, for the super chat. Justin is God, duh. Well, the son of God. God is Doug, but he's the son of. We have to be honest here. He's not the same as his father. He's equal to, but not the same. But he is the same, but he's not the same. And then also,
I am begotten.
Yeah, I'll get these supers here in a bit if that's cool with you, Justin, so we can lay out our material. Okay, real quick here. Sharing screen. I want to show the coin. Where's my coin at? Here we are. There we go. It's kind of harder to. It's Roma, not Nike, but you can actually see the 7 hills that she's sitting on, and she's Rome. And by the way, this coin was minted in 71. But by the way, I mean, this is a well-known thing. And the like 1st century BCE was known as a city on 7 hills, all the way into the Common Era. So it's not like it's time-stamped to the Jerusalem temple's demise. Full preterism has an obsession with purely only looking at Jerusalem for all its answers. The destruction of Jerusalem for like all the solutions, all the timestamps, everything. Anyway,
it's crazy. So I mean, the fact that Babylon is Rome, I think you don't need a whole lot to establish. I don't know. I've never seen a serious New Testament scholar who would disagree with that statement.
I know that. So I did a deep dive on this one time. Margaret Barker does try to make a case for this, and she tries to quote an Enochian passage, but it's talking about a celestial city that is something to do with 7, but it doesn't say 7 hills. So it's like grasping at straws already to try and make it Jerusalem, but there is no contemporaneous anywhere within centuries until you get to, I think, around 1000, medieval period, where there's a rabbinic source that I think mentions it 1,000 years later, dude. Good job, everybody. You found something 1,000 years later or something, 700 to 1,000 years later. It's crazy.
They love searching rabbinic writings as long as they can find one nugget that agrees with them, but they'll ignore the 90% of rabbinic writings that disagree with them. It's the crazy amount of cherry picking.
How many times have you debated where someone quotes, well, Bart Ehrman says, and then you go, do you agree with Bart Ehrman's conclusion?
Right.
They rarely do. Yeah.
No, they just want to cherry pick the information that they like. But the book of Revelation is a problem. Now, to be fair, I think most preterists are, the book that they're working with the most is Revelation. That's the book that they have to do all this work on to say that it came true. because that really is the book that seems to be the most problematic for them. The funny thing is, I'm not a preterist, right? But the funny thing is, most scholars agree that what was written in Revelation was supposed to be for that time period that it was written in.
Of course. That's why it was attractive to me as a Christian, because, think about it, man. I mean, you have this choice between Jesus said something and you never noticed it before. No one said, hey, the Greek word mello means soon, it's near, it's about to happen. You're not really aware of the Greek usually. You're not really aware of the time expectation, that there's an expiration date on these things, right? Once they put that in your face and go, look, don't you see it? And you do see it. It's there. This is the last hour. These are the last days. The night is far spent. Dawn is right around the corner. Or in the book of Revelation, right? The very first chapter and last chapter opens and closes. Opens with, write these things down, for these things are about to take place. And then the end says, hey, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, because the time is near. Yep. And of course, we have an angel in the book of Daniel that says, seal up the words. So if Daniel sealed up the words, even if we pretend the traditional believing stance that Daniel's writing in Babylon into the Persian Babylon transition 500-600 years earlier, he's saying seal up the book because it's far off, right?
For later. Yeah, like Isaiah 8.
Right. So that's 500-600 years is called far off. If 500-600 years is called far off, and he's saying this is soon, you would think less than 500 to 600 years, the end is supposed to happen. At least if it says it's near. Now you would expect closer to that. But yeah, they see this, and as a Christian, I saw it and went, oh my gosh, the words of the Bible are true. I'm a Protestant. I'm a fundy. I believe the words of God, and Jesus said these words, and well, I'm not going to deny my Lord, and he cannot be wrong. Therefore, what he said had to have happened, and my mind made sure the pieces to the puzzle fit.
Yeah. So Revelation, I think, is one of those books where if you do enough words don't mean words, you can get to a preterist position. I think the Old Testament destroys it, but we'll touch on that next. We started with the bodily resurrection. I think that's important. If you go to Revelation 20 is, you got the 1,000-year reign.
You want me to grab my Bible, or?
Can you put it on your, do you have room on your screen? You can follow along.
I can share the screen if you think we should.
Well, I'm not going to read a whole lot.
Okay. Go ahead.
But so in Revelation 20, there's the 1,000-year reign, and then what happens? Then Satan is released from prison. He's destroyed, and then it says that the dead are judged.
Right.
And then we've got two resurrections. So, for example, in Revelation 20:11, it says, "I saw a great white throne, the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. Also another book was opened, and the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up its dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done." Okay, so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if this happened prior to 70 AD, where were the manifestation of dead bodies? Why didn't we see them? There should have been millions, nay, billions of dead bodies brought up from Hades to be judged. Do you want us to believe that they were just invisible bodies that nobody saw?
Yes. No, yes. Because you are an unbeliever, an ungodly unbeliever. I kid you not, Justin, that we do not accept with spiritual eyes. And I've heard a major proponent of it, Preston. Now, I know what you're saying, Don K. Preston, right? Very nice guy. I mean, I love this guy, okay? I respect him, gentleman, but I completely disagree with him, right? He quotes the famous Elisha stuff where he says, look, the angels appear on the mountains with swords, but no one else can see it, right? So it's unfalsifiable, but yeah, they want you to believe it happened. And they don't agree amongst themselves. There are factions within full preterism that literally hate or extremely despise each other on how they interpret what's called IBV and CBV, corporate body view and individual body view. And so there are different ways in which some of them still believe that when you die, then you face judgment. Others say judgment happened and is a corporate thing, kind of like corporate national Israel versus individuals. It's like theological minutia, as you know. But yeah, that's exactly what they want you to believe is billions. However, I wouldn't even say, is it billions? I'd say maybe millions, hundreds of millions of humans. Because I think the population, I did like a search on this, like generally speaking, humans, Homo sapiens, since a couple 100,000 years ago, they say like 10 million humans have been on Earth, as far as they know. You know what I mean? I don't know, based on genetics. I don't know.
Well, before we move, I want to talk a little bit about the bodies, but also if we're talking about the judgment, right, where everyone is brought to Jesus for judgment, we can't move too much further until we also look at Matthew 25, because in Matthew 25, we learn that there's more components. It's more than just the dead coming up from Hades to be judged, right? There's more people involved. It says in Matthew 25:31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Well, if that's the case, we should have seen all the nations of the earth get gathered before him. And I know that people are going to say, well, it's nations doesn't mean nation. It's not saying all the nations. It's referring to just the people, right? It's a generic term meaning just the people that were there in the land of Palestine. But that actually couldn't be true, because if you flip backwards to Matthew 24, the judgment is also hinted at in Matthew 24. It says, when the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. They will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call. They will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Well, we know this from the Bible and extra biblical Jewish literature, that the four winds is referring to the furthest extents of the earth. Everything under heaven that's where the elect are going to be collected from. This judgment is clearly a global judgment where all people, dead and alive, are going to be gathered together for judgment. And you just can't tell me that happened on its lonesome in 70 AD and somehow the Native Americans just forgot to RSVP.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's one of they got to solve this problem, right? Because they're like, well, damn, the mission that the Christians went on, the first century preterists, right, fulfilled. Well, it was the Roman Empire, you know, the ecumene, literally the Roman Empire is the known world that was to be searched. That's it. Nothing beyond that. And it's kind of interesting, even if you granted that. Again, remember now we play these games with them back, right? It's like, okay, grant it to them. Now what? But your point is a very powerful one, because when Paul in Athens, remember, this is part of scripture. They don't compartmentalize literature like you and I might. You and I could read Acts and then read Galatians. They contradict. They do not agree with each other on this point. Paul did not make 2 visitations to Jerusalem, just one or whatever, depending on the source you're looking at. And in Acts 17, after he gives this spiel to the Epicureans and Stoics, he's telling them one man from all the nations of the earth from one man. God appointed the times and places and the boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you were ignorant then, but now. So there's this like conjunction where it's like, now he's telling all men everywhere to repent for the judgment that's about to happen. Now, why the hell are you in Athens telling non-Jewish, non-Christian pagans, if judgment was supposed to happen over 1,000 miles away? I looked at the geography to see how far Athens was. It depends on what route you take, water or land. Land is pretty far. It's like 1,700 or something. I can't remember. I'm literally hip firing off the top, but it's over 1,000 miles away in the ancient world. It's not like you can get in the car and drive for 2 days and finally get there. Why, if Jerusalem's the final judgment place, is he warning them all the way out here? Like, what kind of repercussions does Bob from, Athens have on this Jerusalem temple? Nothing.
Yeah, and he warns Tyre and Sidon for the judgment as well. So if Tyre and Sidon are part of the judgment, we have to conclude that these are people that are not part of the Jewish people. Tyre and Sidon classically were once allies with Israel, and then they were judged later in the Old Testament because they decided to side with the Mesopotamian powers and piss God off, right? And so that's why we get like this judgment on Tyre in the book of Ezekiel and elsewhere. So they just weren't part of Israel. I know they're close to Israel, like they're like on the borders of Israel, but they're not Israel. So if the judgment extends to Tyre and Sidon, I can't see a reason why it wouldn't be extending to all the other nations. Why are we trying to limit it to just Palestine?
Well, because there's problems. They are not futurist. So at least futurists let the can keep getting kicked. Well, it didn't happen yet. Right. Like right now, many Christians laugh about the recent rapture stuff. You know, this idiot, he set the date. But like internally, they're thinking one day he's really going to come. And it's like, you know, you just keep kicking it down the road, man. It's never going to happen. He's never coming. Just make that very clear. Couple super chats real quick, if you don't mind here. Doc Paromanot said, everyone argues Nero versus Domitian, but John's Parchment, Postal Network, and polished Greek scream post-70 affluence. You don't write a luxury apocalypse from a war zone. You need trade routes, not tribulation. He's a fan. But yeah, I get it, especially when you study the apocalypse of John as a well-crafted apocalypse. It's not like this guy's really having a vision and he's writing down the vision. It's so patterned and structured. It's not like an authentic vision. This is a literary piece, like Ezekiel's apocalypse. It's fiction, writing in a way that's conveying probably some social political stuff. And a lot of it we may never decipher completely, but much of it we can.
Right. And in Revelation, remember too, if we're talking about the judgment must be preceded by the battle with Gog and Magog. You can bicker all you want about who you think Gog and Magog is referring to, but the reality is there needs to be like an actual physical battle. And if you read Ezekiel, it's a real physical battle. And if you think that it's the same battle referenced in Zechariah, well, in Zechariah, it's a real physical battle.
Yes.
So if that didn't take place, what are we talking about? But even in Ezekiel and in Zechariah, who wins that battle? Who wins it? It's the Jewish people. They win. Right. God rescues his people.
Yeah. So no matter what path you go down, Justin, your point is gold. It's supposed to be an actual war. I think obviously they grant the judgment was actual. The resurrection, spiritual. I mean, there are some who think that when Jesus warned them to flee to the mountains, a small group of elect Jews went to the mountains that were Jesus's disciples and others, and they got sucked up into heaven when the second coming happened because they were hidden behind a cloud or behind a mountain no one could see. Like, it's unfalsifiable, right? It's like, I could tell you all sorts of stuff. You can either believe me or not, but I can't prove it, and you can't prove me wrong. But the point you say is very important. It's like the glory and like the outcome is supposed to look favorable to national, not Daniel. Because see, Daniel starts to do this very like elect within the elect kind of stuff. Like later Second Temple Jews, what they do is they start to like realize, man, a lot of them realize that the 10 northern tribes are lost. And a lot of them realize that there's no like every single individual. No. There's a 10% within that God's preserving an elect remnant. So Zechariah seems more like a national Jews or Israel at large, the people of God are going to win a real battle. Instead, what do we see? The opposite happen in 70 AD.
Right. Yeah.
What the heck?
And for those who don't know, like, okay, the final battle, whether you want to call it Armageddon, I don't care what you call it. In Zechariah 14, we have a description, and it says, "See, the day is coming for the Lord when the plunder taken from you will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem." So these are outsiders.
Mhm.
I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to do battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights in the day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand upon the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east, and on the Mount of Olives shall be split from two, east to west, so on and so forth. And so we have this idea that God's going to show up in this battle and fight on behalf of Israel. It says, then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. The idea that God's going to come and then destroy his own people, that's not in there. That's not part of the vision. That's crazy.
It is wild.
Yeah.
They'll go to a different passage, though. They won't use that typically, from what I understand. They'll go to Deuteronomy, and they'll find this passage, which has nothing to do with 70 AD. It has to likely do, and critical scholars, I think, are right, to a post. It's written after probably the Deuteronomist
Right.
or a priestly scribe, somebody after the Babylonian exile. It prophesies, Moses says something like, we know it's not Moses, but Moses says something like, hey, you guys are going to eat your own children. Judgment's going to come on you. You're going to cannibalize your own flesh. And so because Josephus saw that actually happened in the war in 70, this is also kind of that double fulfillment. Jews practiced it too. It wasn't just Christians. By the way, earliest Christians were Jews, just so everybody knows. Or at least maybe we don't want to call them Christian because that identity becomes an evolved one. You understand. Christ followers were Jews to begin with. But that point of finding cannibalism happened according to the Babylonian conquest, where Babylon destroys Jerusalem. So here you have a text that just so happened to fit and could be fulfilled at any time in the future when humans have to cannibalize in order to survive. Well, it's like Nostradamus, dude.
It does come true if you read the books of Kings and you read Lamentations. What does it say? It says, when the siege in Jerusalem became heavy, they ate their own children.
Yep.
I mean, that's just what happened. The same battle we find in Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah 12 really thought this battle was imminent. And in Zechariah 12, he says, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of reeling for all of the surrounding people. So this battle must be with all of the surrounding people. And says it will be against Judah also in the siege against Jerusalem. On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the people. All who lift it shall be grievously hurt, and all the nations of the earth shall come together against it. So all the nations are going to come together against Jerusalem. It says, on that day, I will strike every horse with panic and rider with madness. But on the house of Judah, I will keep a watchful eye, and when I'll strike every horse of the people with blindness, then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strengthened the Lord of hosts, their God. And then God rescues them from their enemies. If this is the end battle, which it certainly seems to be, most Christians would interpret this to be that, because it couldn't be anything else, then this just cannot be 70 AD. God is not coming to destroy his own people. He's coming to rescue his own people.
Absolutely. It's weird how they just flip it. So when they say salvation, they'll probably do some anachronistic thing and say salvation from death, and then they'll describe death as Ephesians 2. You were dead in your trespasses and sins. You were already dead, which shows that you're alive physically, but you're dead. So he saved you. Well, it obviously isn't physical salvation. And so all they're doing is spiritualizing the material and saying, no, it did happen. It just, the salvation was completely different, and there's no way I could ever prove it to you.
Right. As long as the fulfillment is immaterial, unfalsifiable, you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't test it, well, then it's just a win. Like, you can't prove me wrong, can you?
You can't. And that's the unfortunate part. Dalton, thank you for the super chat. Y'all def convinced me on Rome being Babylon 100%. If that convinced you that quick, sincerely, there is so much more material that you should actually go look at. In fact, John Dominic Crossan has a book called Render Unto Caesar that you should read, where he goes through the coinage. I mean, he goes through, this has relationship to kind of some of the rhetoric in John Dominic Crossan's view to when Jesus talks about when they say, should we pay taxes? And in the gospel, he's kind of saying, whose icon is on the coin? Clearly, it's a Caesar. And he points out that at this time, the coinage would have had something like this Caesar's a divine. They're gods. And so he pretty much is saying, give back to Caesar his coin, meaning pay the taxes, but give to God what's God. It's a clever way to get out of this kind of thing. So, but when you start diving into this stuff, John Dominic Crossan covers all sorts of stuff that shows Babylon was clearly Rome. And here's the other giveaway that's obvious to me, maybe not to someone who's completely indoctrinated on full preterism, but who destroyed Jerusalem the first time? Babylon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who destroyed Jerusalem the second time? Jerusalem? Yes, full preterists like to say that's actually accurate, Derek. It was the rebels in the temple that destroyed Jerusalem. And it's like, bro, everyone knows Rome encircled. Even your own gospels talk about Rome encircling the city. Rome is the one destroying the temple. So there's a reason why it's identified as Babylon. For that very reason alone, it was the one who participated in destroying your temple like the first Babylon did. So it's pretty simple.
Right.
Anyway, sorry.
And it's pretty clear that was who the Jews thought were Babylon. Even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you already see people reinterpreting Babylon as Rome. So, for example, in the Habakkuk Pesher, we see a clear reference to the Chaldeans in the Habakkuk prophecy now being the Kittim, which at the time it was written most likely was Rome. It could have been Greece, but most likely Rome at this point. So the reality is, like, we know there was a movement to reinterpret these prophecies as Babylon is now Rome. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when we see the early Christians doing it. But last thing I'll say on the bodily resurrection, if we are going to be resurrected at the end of this battle and we're going to be judged, right? The reality is it's going to be in the body, because our resurrection is going to be like Christ's resurrection, because he went before us. He was the first. And how did Christ resurrect? It was in a visible body. Was it special? Sure. Yeah, he could walk through walls. We get that. We know it was a little bit different, but it was a visible body. People saw the dude.
Right. I like this logic. First fruits, right? He's the first fruit.
Yep.
And then those after, right? So you would think it's going to be the same kind of resurrection as the guy who came first. It's the same harvest. You're part of the same agricultural imagery, but you're going to say, sorry, no. The first fruit did something so different. And then, which clearly you and I don't believe any of it, but it's like, if you're going to be consistent with the text, that has clear implications. And then Anastasis to stand up seems to me to rise. There's some kind of bodily resurrection, even if you wanted to go down a path, which I have scholars who debate this, the body's more pneumatic and not, the literal corpse in the same identical way, but that corpse has been transformed. Some even argue that the corpse could have still been in the ground, but there was still some other body force. I mean, most, I imagine, take the corpse view. But I'm saying there is dispute. There is dispute among scholars, Steve Mason, James Tabor, others who do take, like, it's possible. They're not dying on a hill, but they think it's possible that a form of a spiritual type of resurrection could have happened, yet they don't die on the hill either. Your point is a good one, though. If the first dude rises and you're accepting the premise of what Christians typically believe, including full preterists, unless they want to be consistent and say Jesus actually didn't rise from the dead physically. And I don't know a single full preterist that's like a Bible believing one who says that. So if they say he rose physically, literally out of the grave, out of a tomb, there's just logic would lead you to the consistency you're pointing out.
If Jesus didn't rise bodily, then there's no reason for the body to be missing. There's no reason for there to be an empty tomb. His body should still be in there.
Right.
So you can't have Christianity without a bodily resurrection. And the last thing is, Matthew sets you up for this. Matthew 27 says, when Jesus cried out again in a loud voice and breathed his last breath, at that moment, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who fell asleep were raised. after his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and into the holy city and appeared to many. So Matthew's setting this up as we've got a taste already of what's to come. Many bodies have already come out of the tomb. What's the how in the world could he make this claim if this was a spiritual, immaterial resurrection? It doesn't make any sense. It's clearly a bodily resurrection, people that were dead coming to life, just like Ezekiel's valley of dry bones.
It's so funny you bring that passage up because Mike Licona was fired for this passage.
No way.
The whole zombie apocalypse that, we jokingly call the zombie apocalypse because all the graves open and the saints go into the city of Jerusalem and see people and they're like, we see them. Even Mike Licona, who's a Christian apologist, scholar, I mean, out of the apologist, he is very sharp, okay, compared to the normal ones that we encounter. And he got fired for taking that more metaphorical, allegorical, because he did not think it had any historical precedence. I mean, when you start realizing how bad this is historically, you kind of are left with having to deal with this, right? And so
it's a tough one.
Notice that there's pendulums swinging on how do we deal with certain passages, but I agree with you. The other red flag, I heard this from Richard C. Miller that kind of proves your point about the body, is Matthew's gospel, which is uniquely doing this. When they come to the tomb, the stone's still there. In Mark, it's already rolled away. When the stone's there, it's like, imagine you and I, they want you, remember, we're the omniscient reader. This is fiction, but pretend it's not. So we're rolling up to the tomb. We're looking at the tomb. The stone's there. We're like, dude, the stone's there. Roll it away. Let's see our Lord. He's not in there. So how did he get out? How did he get out of the tomb if the stone is there? And in those days, according to Richard Miller, he says, divinities, not ghosts and phantoms, because ghosts and phantoms can pass through walls, but they can't physically, tangibly touch or eat or anything like that. Gods could. So they could metamorphosize through walls. Right. And the fact that he's out of the tomb and the stone was there when they moved it, it gave the symbol of divinity that they needed. And then it gets even more when you get into Thomas and John, where, we always know the famous story, my Lord, my God. Thomas touches him. And what really gives it away isn't just that he touches him, that adds the element of his physicality, which might be knocking down Docetism or some other heretical views. But it's the fact that the passage says that the door was closed twice. It's like, hey, the door is closed. The door is closed. Like, the text wants you to know that there's no way anyone can come in. And then all of a sudden, Jesus appears. Right. How did he get through there? Well, he's a God. And that's why he says, my Lord, my God. So it's powerful stuff in terms of mythology.
Mythology is the right word for it, for sure. But I think if you're reading the New Testament, like you're just reading this as you're expecting at the end a judgment where there's a physical body of both the living and the dead that gets judged, even if you do get some sort of glorious body. Because even the angels, we learn in the Psalms, the angels ate the manna from heaven. It says in the Psalms that the Israelites, when they received the manna, ate the bread of the angels. So like everything about the Old Testament would lead us to believe that the angels had bodies, God had a body, that they're just dwelling up there in the heavens. And certainly most New Testament scholars would concur that even Paul might have had this view that the celestial bodies were divine based on the reading of 1 Corinthians 15. But let's move on to the last thing I'm going to say. I got two more things to say in Revelation before we get into my favorite topic, which is the Old Testament.
Gotcha.
So Revelation 16, famously, we have the bowls of wrath. And I don't see how you allegorize these bowls of wrath or make them go away. So, for example, it says, the first angel poured out his bowl on the earth, and a foul and painful sore came on those who had the brand of the beast and who worshiped the image. Now, you could say there was a plague that broke out. You could say that something happened to the people that were present in Jerusalem. The reality is, I don't know we have a record of it. Is there a record of this ever happening? I don't know of it.
honestly, I don't have a clue what they would pin the tail on the donkey with that one. I imagine they would do it somewhere around the war because a lot of full preterists like to make everything about that. But the problem, like you say, is why is this the most cataclysmic day of all revelatory history? It's not just human history. It's like this is supposed to be it.
It's the big one.
It's the big one. And you're coming up short. Not just short.
Right.
You're coming up so insignificantly short and so dramatically wicked as a god. If this is the case, your God is so terrible. I'm going to be honest, man. Like he's pouring out his bowl of wrath on his own people, like that he had covenant with all along. And you're better off being a pagan from Macedon than you are ever being a Jew, ever being God's chosen at this point. Your risks, you know what I'm saying? So it's insanity to me. But I don't know. I mean, I can imagine them doing that. It's just, again, it's so cataclysmic sounding. It's supposed to be earth shattering. And then what?
Right.
A local famine broke out and they were hungry. I mean, like, how are you going to minimize the language here to meaning practically not much, you know?
And there's so much there that's like the second bowl of wrath. I don't know how you minimize the second and the third bowls. So the second angel poured out his bowl into the sea. We can only assume we're at a minimum it's the Mediterranean Sea. I don't know what other sea they'd be referring to. You could say the Dead Sea, but everything's already dead in the Dead Sea. It'd be redundant to do it. But it says pulled out his bowl into the sea. It became like the blood of a corpse, and every living thing in the sea died. Okay, if the water of the Mediterranean turned blood red and everything died in it, nobody wrote about that shit. Are you kidding me? No, you can't tell me that. That's crazy. That every culture, there were entire cultures that made their living on the Mediterranean Sea. How could you not write about this? It's asinine to think that this actually happened.
It clearly didn't. And the full preterist I know would probably say, yeah, it's not literal.
It couldn't be.
It can't be literal. So they'll just say it wasn't literal. A lot of them, it depends on what camp and who they are. We'll say, oh, well, it's all just fiction. And then that's the biggest other cop out I hear now is like every single book, every single story, unless you can really anchor it to something that may have happened, we're just dealing with fantasy land. So there's no verisimilitude to actual history in any of it.
Right.
So when you have to go that far, it's like, okay, whatever to keep your full preterism true. Because I know people who are now full-blown atheists who still think full preterism is true. Not ontologically, not theologically. They now, because they're so hook, line, and sinker sunk into this theology, they don't have another way of anchoring this interpretation to the text, but what they've been indoctrinated in the last 10 years. So they're stuck with the conclusion that it all happened in 70, but when they realize all the problems, and then they go, well, it didn't all happen, but it happened in a fictional sense, but it didn't happen. Like, it's like they're stuck having to make everything fit, shoehorn it in.
Yeah, it's got to be wearisome to spend all your time wrangling words to mean what they don't mean. And then the next bowl of wrath goes into the rivers, right? And it says they became blood. Well, surely that didn't happen. None of the major rivers in the area became blood. And then it says on our next bowl of wrath, fourth angel poured his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. When in the world do we see in around 70 somebody reporting that the sun became hotter and was burning people? Like, there's just nothing like that. The fifth angel pours out the bowl of wrath, and now the kingdom of the beast, which we have to assume is either Rome or Jerusalem. It's got to be one of the two.
It's Rome.
Was plunged into darkness. When did that happen? When did the kingdom of Rome get plunged into darkness, and who wrote about it? And then the sixth bowl of wrath, the Euphrates River dries up. Well, that certainly didn't happen. And then the seventh bowl is poured out into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings of so on and so forth. Now, the last bowl of wrath, you could definitely see, well, like, okay, well, maybe that was the war that happened in 70 until you get to the end of it. And it says huge hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, dropped from heaven onto people until they cursed God for the plague of the hail. Okay. I don't know about you. I've never heard anybody in the first century talking about 100-pound hailstones. It's
Yeah.
just not a thing.
Yeah. Obviously, this is cataclysmic. It didn't happen. And they'll just say, well, yeah, that's the point. It's metaphorical, cataclysmic language, maybe describing some mundane events, but they're just being overly dramatic. And they might point to somewhere like Babylon's destruction in the Old Testament, where it talks about the mountains melt with wax, or with wax, or the stars, and this, all this cataclysmic language, which just meant a war between Babylon and Jerusalem, or something basic, right? That's pretty much what they'll do.
Then the last thing I'll say about Revelation, and I know that preterists have spent a great deal on this passage because it's such a make or break passage for them. Revelation 21. When I saw a new heaven and new earth, the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. The sea was no more. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. We can read more. We'll pause there for a minute. This idea of the new Jerusalem, the preterists want you to think that this is just now the Christians. Christians are the new Jerusalem, or some other nonsensical interpretation of that point. But in Revelation 21, it's something that comes down out of heaven visibly. If it's not something dropping down from heaven, and even we see the disciples asking, when is the kingdom coming down? The expectation is that there is a new Jerusalem that's coming down out of heaven to replace this shithole Jerusalem.
It goes beyond just the apocalypse of John, because a lot of people go, well, that's just, again, we're in the apocalypse of John. It's all just apocalyptic language. But in Paul's letters, where he talks about being snatched up in Thessalonians, this rapture idea, which we know has Roman imperial language, the Greek there implies meeting the emperor at the gates and then escorting the emperor in. So you meet him out here, but then you bring him in. Well, the implication is that the believers will meet him in the air, where Christ is, where he reigns or is coming down to, and then you're escorting him down to earth, where he defeats his foes. This is the apocalyptic imagery that Paul has. And so it makes sense. And if you jump to the prayer that the gospel portrays Jesus as, on earth as it is in heaven, there is this apocalyptic anticipation that hopefully heaven will come to earth and in all that's going on here. So that expectation, I think, is there. And I think you can find it outside of you don't just find it within the New Testament too. You find this in Jewish writings all around.
Right. And certainly we can make a case that Ezekiel chapter 40 to the end of the book is this new Jerusalem. We can worry about Ezekiel when we get there. And then the last thing on Revelation 21 is, okay, the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. What next? It says, see, the home of God is among mortals. Well, classically in Jewish literature, the home of mortals is the earth. That's why we get the renewed earth. That's the home of the mortals. It says, we will dwell with them. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. Now, I know they're going to say that death doesn't mean death. I get it. You can do that all day, but you can't tell me that the rest of this came true. There's obviously still mourning and pain and crying and loss and heartache. And that has always been the case. Nothing has ever changed in that regard, not before, not after 70 AD. So what actually came true here in 70 AD?
Think about that too, what you just said. Obviously, they're different. I don't want to speak for them as straw man them. I don't know exactly what they'll say when it comes to every detail there. I know that they'll say, like, no more tears, no more suffering. They like to go back to Adam and Eve. They like to go back to the beginning, and they like to say, death doesn't mean death. It's spiritual. It's covenantal. With that original covenant, there's the anguish of the law, right? They have this very negative view of the law, which the Old Testament doesn't have that view. Jews did not have that view. This would have been something a non-Jew would have definitely had a view of. So or maybe a Hellenistic Jew who struggled at the borders of between both cultures. But think about the outcome of this. The language, no more tears, no more suffering, no more darkness, no more death, no more this. And the fact that Christians from day one understood this language that way. And for 2,000 years, God's people have not understood their own text, right? Granting, pretend that the full preterists are right just for this. It's like, who's right here? Do you honestly think the guys who are like inheriting this material, passing this material on, or you way down here have figured it all out? And of course, words don't mean what they say they mean. You have to have the decoder. You have to make tears mean something different and all this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you can't just take it at face value. You're just
Right.
not allowed to. And with that, we'll put away Revelation, but I want to touch on what you said, because the Old Testament view of the law was anything but that. And Psalm 19 says the law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. It tells us to meditate on the Lord's law. I mean, everything about the law was good. In fact, Deuteronomy 12:28 classically says that by doing the law, you're doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. And Deuteronomy 30:31 tells you that not only should you be doing it forever, but it's not even hard for you. For example, Deuteronomy 30:11 says, surely this commandment that I'm commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. We know it's not too hard for them. Zachariah and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1 were said to be righteous according to all of the commandments of the law. We've got lots of people in the Bible that were righteous according to the commandments of the law as well. But listen to what Deuteronomy 30 says. You classically already know about the blessings and cursings from, Deuteronomy 28:29 and so on. But we read about this period after the cursings when God restores his people. Deuteronomy 30. It says, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. We Christians would understand this as being the Messianic age. When Jesus came, we get the circumcision of the heart, not the circumcision of the flesh, right?
Right.
Okay, well, so now we're talking about the Messianic age. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, in order that you may live. Then the Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on the adversaries who took advantage of you, and then you shall again obey the Lord, observing all of his commandments that I'm commanding you today. All of the commandments in Deuteronomy were given in one day. This was Moses' final speech before he died and they went into the promised land, which means at a bare minimum during the Messianic age, it's going to include God's people following the commandments that were given at a minimum in Deuteronomy. It just has to. So
Right.
Paul is a heretic of heretics. He's out of his mind in 1 Corinthians 9:20 when he's saying that I'm no longer under the law. And preterists thinking that the law needed to be done away with because they had to be good Christians, they don't know the Old Testament either.
Mic drop. You made me think of, you're in the Deuteronomy section. I can't remember I think it's Deuteronomy. I can't remember what chapter, where Moses addresses the people of Israel at heaven and earth, right? This
Same
phrase,
chapter.
Okay, same chapter. So
Yep.
I think that needs to be dealt with, because when I was a full preterist, I'll just paint the full preterist and I'll let you tackle what seems to be going on there. And maybe I'll add some icing or cherry on top if I think something needs to be elaborated. Because when I was a full preterist being persuaded of this position, they would say heaven and earth. That is a phrase that comes together. Heaven and earth. It's a common phrase in the Bible, which means the covenant people. It just means Israel. It's his covenant people, him and his covenant people. So heavens and earth is the people of Israel and his covenant with them, practically. So when it says a new heavens and new earth, new people, new covenant, it's that simple. They do not take it as cosmological whatsoever, and they've misread this original passage, which they've led as a key interpreter for all the later passages, bro. It takes years to unlearn this kind of nonsense, but feel free to school us, educate us here.
So we're still in the same chapter, Deuteronomy 30, like you said. And in verse 19, we get the passage that you're referring to. And it's really interesting because the preterist interpretation of this verse only works if you do two things. One, you don't read it carefully. Number two, you don't know anything about the ancient Near East. So first it says, I call heaven and earth to witness. This is the end of God's covenant, right? Deuteronomy reads like a suzerain vassal treaty or a covenant where it includes blessings and cursings. And then at the end of all ancient Near Eastern covenants, you call witnesses. That's the end of the covenant, right? It says verse 19, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, holding fast to him, so on and so forth. Okay. So the first thing is, it couldn't be the people of Israel, because he says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you. You are the people. You're the people in this covenant. Heaven and earth are witnessing against you, which means it's got to be something else. It can't be the people witnessing against the people. It wouldn't work. The witness is always somebody external to the parties that hold the parties guilty. So if you break that covenant, it's somebody external to that covenant that's going to make sure you get what's coming to you. And this is clear throughout the Bible. It's clear throughout the entire ancient Near East and even in the law codes. So for example, at the end of the Hammurabi law codes, they call all these gods into witness. And then it says, may the mighty gods of heaven and earth, yada, yada, yada. The idea that we're calling on all the powers and principalities of heaven and earth as witness is such a common thing. You'll be hard pressed not to find a treaty in the ancient world that doesn't say it. The vassal treaty between Esarhaddon and I forget which nation it was, the very end of it. And even at the very beginning of it, you've got at the beginning of it, it says, I adjure this by the gods of heaven and earth.
Right.
And then the Hittite treaty between Mursili and also the people of Amaru, he calls all the gods to witness. And then he starts naming earthly bodies, the mountains, the rivers, the springs, the great sea, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds. Let these be witnesses to this treaty, to this oath.
Well, that doesn't mean earth and mountains and tree. I'm just kidding.
It's so common. If you've ever read anything from the ancient Near East, you would read Deuteronomy 30 and be like, oh, this is the end of the treaty. For example, another treaty between I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but it's Luimus. There we go. With Kurtawaza, it says the same thing. I call the mountains, the rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds as witnesses. And then another treaty between Esarhaddon and Tyre says, may the gods of heaven and earth, the gods of Assyria, the gods of Akkad, the gods of Ever, Nari, curse you with an insoluble curse, so on and so forth. Every ancient treaty, all the ancient law codes had some sort of witness at the end of it, even wedding contracts. If you read like wedding contracts, land contracts, at the end of these contracts, there are witnesses, and quite often there are God's names invoked, and there are people that will hold you accountable. So anyways, all that to
even
say,
today, Christian weddings, they invoke Christ as a witness to, it's the same stuff.
It's so like if you are reading Deuteronomy 30:19 and you think heaven and earth is a reference to something present with them at that time, it's just not. It's just a reference to I bear witness to anything there is to bear witness to hold me accountable to this treaty. That's all he's saying.
Wow.
It's a huge cope to think that it's anything but that.
That's why when Jesus says, not a jot or tittle of the law shall pass away until a new heavens and new earth, you are wishful thinking if you are not understanding this within its ancient Near Eastern or even the cultural context. I mean, Romans had this idea of the heavens filled with deities. Even the Jewish worldview, for those who don't know, there's one God they worship, but it's a sky filled with angels, with a council. And we know that idea was once God's, polytheistic in some way, but it shifts to angels over time that still are in the heavens that are witnessing. And so you're dealing with cosmology, but also the geographic location where these divinities would be located. And you're imagining a real change in cosmology. That's why the natural, and I think the common interpretation that always has been in 2 Peter, when it talks about the elements shall melt with fervent heat, It's literally making over a new cosmos. Now, why do I
Yeah.
know that? He literally refers back to the flood, which we know flooded the earth. Now, you can be a local flood advocate if you want, because that's the only solution they have typically, is to try and go, it's a local flood. Here's a local judgment on Jerusalem. And I've heard it said, I kid you not, the elements did melt with fervent heat, and the elements that it was talking about were the elements within the inner Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. I shit you not, Justin. This is how far they will go to make it work.
The elements, like if you're a first century Greek speaker, you know what the elements are. Like,
Right.
this is crazy.
It's no doubt, you have it's so obvious, right? So I look, I'm going to make you laugh. Okay. There are proponents of this book, right? I read this. I was what was called a covenant creationist. I'll spare you all the details. Okay. But just to say this, some of them have hypothesized, and look at the cover, right? So you see how it's Jerusalem temple. What's that right there?
Noah's boat at
Or
the
you see
Jerusalem
the
temple.
flood waters, right, that are surrounding the Jerusalem temple. What also does the Bible call waters?
Shoot.
Nations.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Oh no. Of
Yes.
course the waters are nations.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, gosh.
So the original temple in Noah's day, the ark was the temple. The animals that were other animals were other nations that came into the temple during Noah's day. I shit you not. Some of them have taken this interpretation that far that Noah is not talking about an actual ark of a boat floating on water, flooded of the earth. Like it's actually a very old temple, and that God, had a chosen people, the high priest Noah, that brings people in, and there's a war. The water represents other nations coming to attack the temple.
That's crazy.
Yeah, bro. Like, screw the whole Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, forget any of this Deucalion, all the other flood myths that say the same stuff and release 3 birds and all of that. Nah, let's have a secret internal code of interpreting all this to make it work.
Somebody needs to produce the preterist dictionary to keep track of this. Like, there needs to be a preterist dictionary, at a minimum, a spreadsheet. You just have to know that words don't mean words.
That's it.
Well-
Because they start with the end and they decode, they go back to the beginning to understand the beginning anachronistically, similar to Christian interpretation, but on steroids. So they find the end and they go, it had to have happened. And it says that the new heavens and new earth have to pass. Jesus himself said that it has to pass and that the end is coming. So it must have passed, which means it must have happened, which means we must have misunderstood what it meant. So then they go back with that in mind and they find a way to make it make sense.
Okay. Except, with this nonsense, like waters is nations, they would only apply that in very select occurrences where they need it. Anywhere else, water just means water. It only means not water in this one instance where I need it to not mean water.
Bingo. Like the woman at the well, what was she getting? Water. She was gathering nations. Duh.
Obviously.
I mean,
that's why she had so many husbands.
That's why she had. Yeah, you just figured out a secret, Justin. We're gonna add it to our book.
Unbelievable.
Oh.
Let's talk about some of the Old Testament prophets. I could have talked about every one of them, but I whittled down to 3 prophets that I think if you're reading these prophecies, it's hard to make a case, not only that they will ever come true, but especially that they came true prior to 70.
Right.
So Jeremiah 31, classic Christian passage. Christians famously think that this came true. Let's read just a couple verses. It says in 31:31, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer Will they teach one another or say, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest, says the Lord, and I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. Okay, so first of all, this promise, obviously, Christians think happened under Jesus.
Right.
Well, I think the Christians and the preterists are both wrong. It says they will all know the Lord. At a minimum, we have to assume that they is Israel. You could say the whole world. You can say the Israelites. It doesn't matter. At a minimum, it's got to be the Israelites. This is a prophecy for Israel.
Of course.
You can't tell me that this came true. It just didn't come true. The Israelites soundly rejected Jesus, and they continue to do so to this day. So you can't put this into the preterist bucket of fulfilled prophecies, because it doesn't even get you into the bucket of Christian fulfilled prophecies. It just didn't come true.
This opens up a can of worms of an offshoot version of full preterist called Israel only. Okay. So this passage, have you heard of them?
Only from Tristan so far.
Okay. Yeah. Tristan, I think he flirted with it at first, and then we had like a 3-hour call on the phone hanging out. He's a cool dude. And I was explaining to him some of the rationale behind why we would say New Testament authors, and if there's anyone on the internet who cooks people in debates, it's you, who can attest to what I'm saying. How often the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, we'll just use the language of Christians, Old Testament, not newer and first and all that kind of stuff, to be all kosher. Old Testament, and they take the context and they apply it, and it has zilch to do with the Christian context. Oftentimes they recontextualize it. It does not mean what they're quoting. So you cannot use the hermeneutic of saying it says this in the original context in Jeremiah and Hosea, whatever, to apply that to your current situation and say, that's what it means here because he quoted it. There's oftentimes like where take 1 Corinthians 7, I believe it is, when Paul it writes and says, brethren, you guys can have a wife and you can get paid for your work, but I don't take money. And then he quotes the law and says, you shall not muzzle an oxen while it threshes. And if you go to the original context and you read before, after, get the context in, it's talking about actual oxen and why you should not torture your oxen with starving them while they labor in the field all day, making your food, helping you to grow your crops. So the original law is about oxen. And what does Paul say? It's not about oxen. It's about us. This is talking about us. He has a magical reinterpretation of a text that has nothing to do with its original context, other than the fact that Paul is working to plant the seeds of the gospel. That's it. Right. So it's spiritualizing an original text. So what this group in Israel only has done, and their variations of it, is they say that Paul, he's confronted with this problem. Now, they don't take it as historical. They always do the myth card I told you about, and they take everything as fiction so they can get out of this hole and they can keep their full preterism. But they say Paul, in order to solve this problem, the Jews, Israelites, are rejecting Christ, like you just said, right? So what does he do? He goes to Gentiles. He goes to non-Israelites, right? That's our position. No. The Gentiles are actually the nations. The nations is where Israel was scattered long ago. Paul's actually on a mission to regather the lost Israelites. So these goyim, these ethne, are actually Israelites. So it fulfills Jeremiah, dude. You can't say it failed. So Paul's
they're not Gentiles. They're actually lost Jews.
Yes, or lost Israelites. Because they'll differentiate between Israel and Jew, and they'll say northern and southern, and they get into all this like technicality of the text. Whereas the common understanding of Romans, where this all takes place, Romans 9 through 11, is the scholarly position I'm still persuaded is the most accurate. Jews aren't buying it, dude. Jews know their scriptures. They're in the synagogue. They're raised around, people who know how to interpret scripture and are professionals at it. And they're not accepting Jesus. And Paul's brokenhearted. He says in Romans 9 at the beginning, I wish I were cut off from my kinsmen, Israelites, according to the flesh. He identifies his own rejectors as Israelites. Then he takes this mission to the Gentiles.
Mhm.
And there's several passages. I won't bore you. We could get into this at some point if I needed to, if we wanted to, into the actual text that he's quoting, because some text he quotes is talking about the lost tribes in Hosea.
Mhm.
And then he quotes passages that aren't talking about the lost tribes, and he identifies his audience with the same crowd. So which is it? Are they lost tribes, or are they completely foreign nations that aren't Israelites? Paul uses both for his Gentiles. And so when you get to the end of it, it says, once the full number of the nations come in, then all Israel shall be saved. And so I think that he's expecting one day that once the number of the non-Israelites come in, those hard-hearted Jews that didn't accept it will eventually come around. And God's going to soften their heart, and then the gospel will be accepted. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, and I think you probably see the problem that I see, which is that if this is what's happening in Jeremiah 31, we have a failure because it says all of them shall know me, which means you could say that Paul's mission was to get these Israelite Gentiles reclaimed, but it's not a process. It couldn't have been fulfilled prior to 70. It had to have been fulfilled after 70, unless you just think there weren't many of them.
They typically pull out the fiction cards, so they don't usually try to ride the history as if something was really going on. There's really groups on the ground that this is talking about. And, it's like you get your hands on the eel. You ever fished and caught an eel? I'm sure you have. All right. They're worse than fish. I mean, they literally just, you can't grip them. They find a way, no matter what you say or do, to make it work. And that's exactly. Line. Yeah, you have to. At some point, you're like, or you cut the eel up and make it bait at some point. But that's the problem, is that when I've tried to get them down into the history, I've used synagogue inscriptions for God-fearers. Mm-hmm. We've literally tried to identify who the actual groups were that would have been targeted at this time in history and stuff. There is no reason to take this as any real thing happening for their model. It just doesn't work with history. And so it works with what I'm suggesting based on the synagogue inscriptions. Language itself attests to what I'm saying, Greek language. And we don't have to get in the weeds, but there's so much there that, like, the past 5 years, things that would have been boring if it weren't for my competitive nature of trying to figure out, that I found out that made me go, holy smokes. But Jeremiah 31, man, we derailed the hell off of that. But just to make the point, like, that's a model of full preterists that try to make sense of it. And I get why, because it was to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It's not a universal, like, mankind covenant that's saying all humans on earth. No. It's two houses and the promises to them. And so I get why they just want to draw that line and make it make sense in the New Testament. But I don't go that conclusion, because I know later authors rework earlier material, like today. Those locusts, those are Apache helicopters, don't you know? Like, there's always a reworking of earlier material, is all I'm saying.
It has to be.
Yeah.
So this prophecy, the restoration of Israel, the new covenant, whatnot, it keeps going in Jeremiah. And if you go into chapter 33, you get more snippets of, like, what the expectation is, right? So in 33, it says, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise that I made to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. Now, you could stand on the Israel only interpretation, and then it still fails. It says, in those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. He shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. Well, as in Israel only, you can be like, okay, that's fine. Yeah, it's in the land. It's Israel only. But it says, in those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem, that's a city now.
Yeah.
Judah is a region. Jerusalem is a city. Jerusalem will be living in safety. So the reality is they didn't live in safety. They did not live in security. They got devastated.
Yeah. There's so many problems, bro. The other problem is when they're dancing in the streets. Okay. Have you heard about that with my buddy Tristan? If you haven't subscribe to Tristan. Go ahead.
I did watch the debate between Tristan and what was the guy's name that was
Don K. Preston.
Yeah. Yeah. I watched that Dancing in the Streets line. It's crazy to think that the promises of jubilation and restoration and peace came true in 70 as God was destroying his people and causing them to eat the flesh of their infants.
I mean, I do get the point, right? I really do. How could you possibly be celebrating while your family, it's not like another nation, people right now, they have all sorts of reasons of stuff that's going on in the world where they have they're hurt or upset by it. It offends them. But then a birthday party comes up or something in their lives, and they're like able to compartmentalize what's going on, let's just say in the Middle East right now or in other places of the world where there's some horrific stuff that's just happening. It's just humans are being terrible humans, right? And then they go to a birthday party and they're able to smile and laugh. And they're like, oh, my son turned 5. And it's like, okay, cool. They forgot about what's going on over here. But the equivalent, to equate this properly, it would be like your 5-year-old was the one being slaughtered. And you're not going to be able to compartmentalize that in a physiological sense. And so that's why he constantly wanted to refer to material science and the mind and all of that to point out, like, you got to make sense of this in reality, dude, because if your 5-year-old, using the analogy, or your mother or your sister or your brother, there's no way you're just turning it off unless you didn't give a shit, which makes you an even worse human being. And how the hell could you even do that? Like, you're claiming to be righteous and just and loving and all these attributes the Holy Spirit says, but you're over here dancing and celebrating while your kid, using the analogy, is doing that or having that happen to him. That doesn't make any sense. So if the viewers go, just in case a viewer doesn't know, full preterists have been saying that when the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD, that is when Jesus came back. That is when the end happened. That is when God judged the righteous and the unrighteous, the wheat and the goat, the chaff and the wheat. Did I say that right? The wheat and the goat. Did I say that? I said the
I heard chaff and wheat.
Yeah, you know what the hell I'm saying. You know what I'm saying, all right? The weed, the marijuana, and I'm kidding. So all that happened, and the saints, the believers, were celebrating that day, the great and terrible day of the Lord, that their enemies, which many of their family members would have been in there as non-Christians, were being destroyed, starved to death, killed by the Romans, and cannibalizing their own in order to survive within the Jerusalem temple, as documented by Josephus, while they're actually inside happy. Some may have cried with tears of joy and danced in the streets. There's no telling what they actually did according to what a full preterist might believe, but just picture, how can you do that? I don't see how it would work for me, in my mind.
No, if God brought death and destruction upon the city that I lived in and was causing my child to be ill or dead or harmed, there's nothing you could do that would cause me to be happy. There's nothing you could do to a parent that cause them to be happy if their child is suffering, unless they're evil. If you're an evil parent, you could get to that point. But the reality is, you cannot interpret Israel as being happy while God is literally destroying them. In fact, he tells you elsewhere that when he destroys you, you won't be happy. In fact, he'll take pleasure in your displeasure. But the prophecy is very clear in Jeremiah 33, because if you back up just a couple of verses, he tells you what it means to live in safety. So you can interpret live in safety to mean whatever you want, as long as you read it in isolation. But in verses 11 through 13, he says, I will restore the fortunes of the land as at first, says the Lord. So this is the land now. He's going to restore the fortunes of the land. It says, in this place that is a waste, without humans or animals, and in all of its towns there shall again be pasture for shepherds, resting their flocks in the towns of the hill country, of the Shephelah, of the Negev, in the land of Benjamin, these places around Jerusalem, and in the towns of Judah, flocks shall again pass under the hands of those who count them, says the Lord. So this is clearly a prophecy about the land, the actual physical territory being restored to peace again. That's what it is.
It's so obvious. So how do you, if you want to answer this, because you see it all the time with Christians who argue with you, how do you get from that to, oh, well, it wasn't actually talking about that? Or there are various texts, right? That text they might grant. A lot of futurists might say, yeah, one day, right? You have a lot of more evangelical Christians, especially Zionist Christians, who might say, no, that's going to happen, right? That is a future thing, and they're working towards funding even that project, right? But when you're looking at it from people who come on and are full preterists, let's say, and they're arguing this, they could just go to the New Testament and notice that, oh, well, they expected this kind of Messiah. They didn't get that kind of Messiah. Oh, they were expecting this. Nope, it's spiritual. So the New Testament plays a new trick at a new time in history with its own scripture to spiritualize a lot of this stuff to make it work, it seems.
And you would have to explain, what is the spiritual Shephelah? How do you spiritualize the foothills? How do you spiritualize the land of the Benjaminites? How do you spiritualize the Negev desert? There's so many small details that they will look over when they try to spiritualize it, that eventually they just run themselves dizzy trying to spiritualize every individual detail. And they'll usually, when I'm debating this kind of nonsense, they'll get tired and be like, well, I don't know what every individual thing means. I just know it's spiritual. Okay, well, if you don't know what every individual thing is, I don't know why I would accept a spiritual interpretation, because I know what every one of those things is literally. I can tell you every one of those things what it is, which means my interpretation obviously has more explanatory power, since I actually know what these words mean. But it goes further, because in verse 17 says, David will never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel. And this is what gets to Christians, the Levitical priests, and that's in the plural. The Levitical priests shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to make grain offerings, and to make sacrifices for all time. So there's actual Mosaic offerings by actual plurality of Levitical priests that need to be ongoing. And according to Preterism, the temple was destroyed forever in 70 AD. The Levitical offerings are not coming back. But according to Jeremiah, when the Messiah is on the throne, those Levitical sacrifices are happening.
I mean, which is it?
It can't be both.
Yeah, it can't be both.
And if you've questioned whether or not this is really about the land, I mean, I'll say it over and over again. You'll see this as we keep reading the Old Testament. It's always about the land. Every promise to Israel focuses on the land.
Yeah.
Jeremiah 3:17-18. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will gather to it, the presence of the Lord in Jerusalem. They shall no longer stubbornly follow their own evil will. In those days, the house of Judah shall join the house of Israel, and together they shall come from the land of the north into the land that I gave your ancestors for a heritage. We know what that land is. The ancestral land is the land of Israel. It's not a metaphor. And it's certainly not Christianity. You can't say that Christianity is the new Israel, that Christians are the new Israel, because that wasn't the land that was given to the ancestors of the Israelites. The land given to the ancestors of the Israelites are the actual Levantine territories. Those were the lands given. So you can't turn this into a metaphor unless you like twist yourself into a million different pretzels.
You got an interesting point. So if any Israel only proponent watches this, what I'd like for them to start doing in all these contexts about their people, right? And the Israel north and south that they say is being regathered, look for land language in all of this. And then ask yourself, did they come to the land? Now, at the end of the day, many of them just cop out with the myth card and go, yeah, it all happened in a fairy tale story. It's like writing a once upon a time to a happily ever after. That's pretty much how they view it. And it's like, damn, like there's so much misunderstanding there, in my opinion, that is going on. Yeah, there's a lot of myth. There's a lot of legend, but like they're writing real shit to real communities of real people that believe this stuff. And there's continuity to the church that continues it after. And it's kind of interesting that even with Christianity 2.0 Judaism, they're still concerned with Jerusalem. I mean, all the way down into the
Mhm.
Islamic conquest period and into the medieval period, they're still fighting over this holy land, calling it holy land. It's sacred, it's important, and they're still dealing with it. So
Mhm.
you have to deal with the land if you're going to properly engage these texts.
It's true. If you read the Old Testament and you didn't realize that the promise is about the land, you didn't read the Old Testament. And just all there is to it. And it's not just in Jeremiah. For example, in Ezekiel 26 and 36, when we read Ezekiel 26, it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, mortal, when the house of Israel lived on their own soil, they defiled it." This is really important. He's laying the groundwork right here. He says, when they were on their own soil, they defiled it with their ways and their deeds. Their conduct in my sight was like the uncleanness of a menstrual period. So I poured out my wrath upon them for the blood that they shed upon the land, for the idols with which they had defiled it with. I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed through the countries in accordance with their own conduct and their deeds that I judged them with. Okay, so Ezekiel is now laying the groundwork in chapter 26, saying, listen, you guys defiled the land. And we should recognize this from Leviticus 18. What does God do in Leviticus 18 if you defile the land? It vomits you out. You're done. Get off the land. You get out of here. You get scattered, right? So it's about the land in every book. And that's why in Ezekiel 26, after he scatters the people that defile the lands, what's he say? I'm going to restore you. He says, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, from all your idols, and I will cleanse you. A new heart I will give you, a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove from your body the heart of stone and the heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and make you to follow my statutes. This is important. This is accompanied by God's people, not just coming to the land, but acting straight. They're coming back to the land, and they all know that the Lord is the Lord, and they don't defile the land again. He says, then you shall live in the land that I gave to your ancestors. Like we just said, the land that was given to the ancestors is the land of Israel. It's not a metaphor. It's not a spiritual body. You're going to live there. And what's God say he's going to do there? He says, you will be my people. I will be your God. I will save you from your uncleanness, and I will summon the grain, make it abundant, and lay no famine upon you. I will never take the fruit from the tree and the produce from abundant and the produce of the field from abundance, so that you may never suffer the disgrace of famine among the nations. So God is saying, you're going to come back to the land, and it's a physical land, because I'm going to make your trees prosper. I'm going to make your grain grow. There's no spiritual fucking fruit trees. There's no spiritual grain growing. This is a physical restoration of the land.
Right. It's interesting you say that, because if you go like just jumping ahead, that would make sense for the ministry of Jesus in Matthew, talking about go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Don't go to Samaritans, and don't go to the nations. He's like, only go to the Israelites. And he says, you will not have gone through all the houses of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Right. So the mission was pretty much Jews. I mean, just go to the Israelites. That's it. Right. But then you get this broadened mission from Paul. And you'll notice that you would think, if he knows his scripture, he's quoting it, he's not saying, hey, Galatians, get your asses down to Jerusalem, to the land, like it was promised. Hey, Thessalonians, hey, Corinthians, Rome, check it out. Guys in Rome, get your asses down here. What are you doing? It's all about to go down. The end is about to happen. We're regathering in the land. It's promised. No, none of that is there. But it works if you do grant that original kind of bubble with Jesus and the 12 is aiming at a exclusively Jewish or exclusively Israel-centric model, which excluded Samaritans and Gentiles. Right. Makes sense.
Which is wild. The Israel only paradigm falls apart when you get to like Isaiah 56, Ezekiel chapter 44, when it talks about the foreigners coming to worship with Israel. So classically, it says in Ezekiel 44 that the foreigners will come and they'll have to be circumcised in the heart and the flesh. Isaiah chapter 56 talks about the foreigners coming and giving actual animal sacrifices and obeying the Sabbath with the Jewish people. So even in the Old Testament, there's not this idea that God is only here for the Israelites. All of the Old Testament points towards this idea that eventually all the nations will recognize Yahweh as the one true Lord. Zechariah 8 famously says 10 men from every language, from every nation will grab hold of the cloak of a Jew and ask to go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. I mean, and we're going to get to, when we get to Isaiah, we'll touch on some of this. This Israel only thing falls apart real fast.
I agree. No, dude, you and me are two peas in the pod here. It's obvious. I like to use the Jonah myth. It's a satire, I think. I think it's a comical myth that is meant to be laughed at. It's meant to be funny, but there's a lesson in it. And what's really interesting about that is, even in just the first chapter, when he flees onto this mountain, which, by the way, the book of Acts parallels this exact myth in the Cornelius story. So here's the one-to-one correlation, just to add that, and I'd love to continue where you're going. At the beginning of Jonah, he doesn't want to go and preach repentance, technically. He doesn't want God to show mercy on Nineveh. Why? If you haven't heard about the Assyrians and what they did, it's important you understand that while this is myth, it's echoing a real historical situation where Assyria conquered the northern kingdom. Samaria was completely demolished. Most of their people were exported, it seems. The most elite, at least important people, were taken and spread all over into various lands by Assyria's hand. So they did horrific things when this all happened. And Jonah is depicting this, and this guy's like, what'd you say, God? Hell no, I ain't doing that shit. And so he starts running, jumps on a boat, gets on the boat, and he's fleeing God, and then a storm comes up. There's good reason to think that this storm myth, by the way, might echo in Homer, but that's a whole nother level, okay? So as the storm happens to come, then they're casting lots or straws or something, and it lands on him. They know he's the reason, and he has to explain, and he goes, look, I've been running from my God. They tried to show him mercy. They're not Israelites on this boat. They're literally doing the thing he's supposed to be doing for the Ninevites. And they're trying to show him mercy because they don't want to kill him and throw him overboard and he dies. And he's like, nope, you're going to have to do it. So they pray to his God in the story. And I think they sacrifice an animal to the God at the end of the story, whatever. He jumps in the water. The fish swallows him. Now the great prayer from Sheol, right? Oh, Lord, I'm in Sheol. I'm at the bottom of the ocean, this giant fish for 3 days and 3 nights. I think it echoes Inanna's descent, Ishtar, with the descent for 3 days and 2 nights. It's echoing a resurrection motif. Third chapter opens, and he's headed for Nineveh. He learned his lesson. So he goes and he preaches for 40 days, and the king of Nineveh and all the people and the animals. I mean, this shit's like down to the animals, dude. Get that.
They put sackcloth on the cattle.
Literally repent and sacrifice to the God of Israel, right? And they're forgiven. There's repentance, there's forgiveness, there's God showing mercy to them and being willing to not destroy them and all of that. And what does he do? He goes and pouts in the 4th chapter outside the gate, wishing to die. And we know the story. The plant grows and covers him. And he's like, what the hell when God destroys it? Did you make that plant grow? Shut up. Did you do this? No. What about this great city with all these people and all these animals? Okay. That's the story of Jonah in a nutshell. God saying, even I made Nineveh. I'm the one behind Nineveh. I'm the God of gods, right? That's the point. When you get to the book of Acts, you'll know that the same port, Jaffa, that Jonah jumps in and gets in the boat and leaves at, is the same port that Peter's located at in Acts chapter 9, moving into Cornelius' story in Acts chapter 10. Peter does not accept the vision and fights it.
Right. Yeah.
He says,
I've never eaten anything unclean, even to this day. Yeah.
Not going to do that, Lord. And next thing you know, he is persuaded, right, that by seeing this non-Israelite receive the Holy Spirit, he is now changed, and he's gone, and now he has to convince Jews that don't accept it in the following chapter after Cornelius, chapter 11, I believe. So now he's persuading them, and then they finally get convinced because they were like, no way this guy can have the Holy Spirit. There's no way. Yeah, he did. And no longer call unclean what God has made clean is the point of saying these Gentiles are on equal with us. That's the whole point of the mission. That tells me there is no like identity above the other within this new movement that's gradually growing, that's portrayed in Acts and seems even in Paul's letters. So following you now, I just figured I'd mention there's scholars who've shown the parallels, and there's definite connection to Jonah and the parallel here to the story. But the theme is, it isn't about you only. You know what I mean? It's a bigger picture.
God's always been concerned with all people. He only starts with Israel. And we'll definitely touch on that when we get to Isaiah. Last thing I'll say about Ezekiel, first of all, there's a lot you can say about Ezekiel. If there's one book that completely like torches Christianity in general, it's the book of Ezekiel. But in chapter 37, we hear about the restoration of the Israelites through this vision of the Valley of Dry Bones and whatnot. And God says, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone. I will gather them from every quarter, bringing them into their own land. So again, we have this idea of God is bringing them from all over the world back to their land, which obviously didn't happen in 70 AD. And said, they shall never again defile themselves with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions. I will save them from all of their apostasies. So you cannot say that ever came true about the Jewish people. If God came to punish his people, and famously a bulk of Jews today don't even believe in Yahweh, how in the world could you claim that this prophecy ever came true? And then in verse 24 talks about what they're going to do when the Messiah is here. My servant David will be king over them. They will have one shepherd. They will follow my ordinances and be careful to observe my statutes, and they will live in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, in which your ancestors had lived. So again, it's always about the land, a physical, actual land that they're going to live in. They're going to be purified. They're going to have new hearts. And because they have new hearts, they're not going to defile the land and get vomited out again. That certainly just couldn't be true of 70. In 70, they got partially exiled. And then in like 132 to 136, under the Bar Kokhba revolt, they literally lost the land. What was left of their land, they lost all of it. It's gone. The opposite of what was prophesied.
Absolutely. I think that's just, it makes no sense on full preterism at all. Like, you have to ignore that. You have to make the land a heavenly place. And that's exactly what they do. They make the land promises just become celestial. You got it wrong all along, guys.
And there's a lot I could say about Isaiah, but I think most people have read Isaiah. So I only want to talk about one passage in Isaiah that gets repeated in Micah. Isaiah 2:4 says he will judge. This is when the Messiah comes, right? So if the Messiah came, or there's stuff that happened during the Messianic age prior to 70, says that he will judge between the nations, arbitrate for many people. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn of war anymore. And of course, Micah 4 famously repeats the refrain, saying that basically the same thing. And then in the next chapter, Micah 5 says what? That the person coming out of Bethlehem is going to be the one of peace, hearkening back to the prior chapter, this time of peace when nobody knows of war anymore. Well, I don't know how any of that can be squared up. There was war prior to 70. There's war after 70. We've known nothing but war ever since 70.
Yeah.
The church itself has sponsored their own wars. The Crusades were church sponsored. So how in the world does this vision of world peace in Isaiah 2, Micah 4 ever come to fruition, unless you just think that when it says nation shall not lift up sword against nation, it must be referring to some microgroup somewhere. But the microgroup has to include Israel, wouldn't it? Like, how could Israel be excluded from the nation?
That, or they literally do gymnastics to make it not have anything to do with war.
It's not really about war. They didn't mean war.
Yeah, it's not really about turning your actual weapons into farming tools. It's not about that. Just like your oxen, muzzling an oxen has nothing to do with muzzling an oxen. It has to do with suppressing paying Paul for his work on getting you the gospel. Of course. And unfortunately, in Isaiah 2, there's other stuff that we can go into that certainly, if you're just reading it, you're like, well, yeah, it just didn't come true. It doesn't look like it's ever going to come true. But we also want to take a look. Did I do anything after Isaiah? No, actually, I didn't drag anything out after Ezekiel and Isaiah. So I think that's all of what I had in my notes. Now, keep in mind,
if you're a full preterist, what that means is you only need one prophecy to not have come true and full preterism falls apart. That's the problem with full preterism, is you need every single prophecy to be true. And the reality is almost none of them came true. There's dozens and dozens of failed prophecies from the Old Testament that didn't come true and are never going to come true.
Yeah. So let's put it another way to word it so that they don't feel the threat of failed. Some stuff, let's just say it's not that it failed, but it's still future, right? It hasn't quite happened, because there's some Christians who think that in effect destroys full preterism. The other thing, though, that is interesting is a lot of these ex eventu kind of prophecies that are written after the fact as though they are fulfilled. That can easily trick a believer, you know what I mean, into being like, this is confirming that it happened. We have a fulfilled prophecy over here. But to say that they're all, if you can find even one that isn't, you've got a problem, right? Unless you want to throw away books or, mess with the canon or get into redaction criticism, which I don't think they do.
No. They're not going to get into any redaction criticism. But the reality is, if you're even if you're a Messianic Jew, I just think that full preterism is out of the gate silly. Like you'll never get to it. Obviously, if you're a real Jew, full preterism doesn't mean anything to you. You're not even a Christian.
Yeah.
So I think in order to get to a place of full preterism, first you have to abandon the hope of the Hebrew Bible. That's gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
This idea that there's going to be peace, there's going to be no suffering anymore. Everyone's going to be restored to the land. There's going to be a king on the throne, a physical throne in Israel, it says. Micah chapter 5:2 famously says that he's going to rule in Israel, which is obviously the land.
Geography. Yeah.
And then it talks about stuff happening in that geography. So you just kind of have to abandon all of the ideas of the Hebrew Bible to get the full preterism. And so like I studied the Hebrew Bible when I was in school as my main concentration. So like when I was taking my classes in Bible college before I got to seminary, I was already aware of full preterism and partial preterism. I already started to think like, well, yeah, you could make some sense of partial preterism on the book of Revelation, but I just don't see how you ever get to full preterism with the Old Testament being what it is, with all these predictions where God clearly states that the physical land that I promised to Abraham, that land you're going to live on, you're not going to defile it anymore. In fact, Isaiah literally says that after the restoration, God's not even going to be mad at you anymore. I'll never punish you again. What are you talking about? You're never going to punish them again. Where are they? They look punished right now. Have we not seen the Holocaust?
Yeah. There's all sorts of stuff. Mr. Morpheus, thank you for the super chat. Great show, Derek and Justin. Really appreciate you being here in the chat, man. Thanks so much. You know Morpheus.
I love it. Yeah, Mr. Morpheus is a good guy.
Dude, he's awesome. He's been helping with my Islam stuff lately. He's, speaks pure Arabic. Okay, I want to make one comment as to why they do it. Again, just full circle here. Jesus says some stuff's supposed to happen. Some of them standing there aren't supposed to taste death. As recently you did a live stream I was in, or debate or something. I popped in and you were dealing with this exact passage. I commented. I don't know if you can see my comments when you're debating. I popped in and popped out because I'm so busy. You know how I am.
I've got 3 streams of comments when I'm live because I'm running 2 YouTube channels and a TikTok channel all during the same stream. So I catch only a fraction of the comments.
Okay. Well, I popped in and just dropped a little comment and dipped. But they always want to say, look, that's the transfiguration 6 days later. And it's like, then nobody died. So why are you saying that? And then the other one that I hear them often do is go Acts chapter 1. That's fulfilling it. Judas did die by then, but, it fulfills it. And it's like, dude, I personally think John chapter 21, it looks like a tacked on chapter to a lot of scholars. That chapter, when Peter said to feed my sheep, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Okay. Well, what about him after Peter's told he's going to die in a way or be taken in and arms spread wide, likely hinting at some kind of awareness of a tradition that Peter was crucified or something. But what about the beloved? What about that guy? Huh? And he's like, if it be my will that he remains, what's that to you? Well, as a full preterist, when I read this, to me, it was like, yo, he's going to remain and Christ is going to come. Like, I totally misread this because I'm like, look, here's evidence in John 21 that the beloved would remain till he comes. So the beloved was alive by the time 70 AD hit. And now I've read it with experts who know the Greek, and they're telling me, no. What it's saying is like, hey, Peter, if I want him to remain, whether I do or don't, I don't know, right? Then, what is that to you? That has nothing to do with you and what's going on with what I just said you're going to have to go through. So again, it repeats it again. And then there's this thing that says, and they said that, he wasn't going to die. So it's like addressing either some type of rumor that one of them isn't going to die, which I think Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists or one of them thinks there's still a living disciple on earth somewhere hidden. Kind of like, I think, not Sunni, but the Shia Muslims, I believe, think there's like someone's hidden till the end times. I can't remember who. Something to this effect. Well, now that I'm reading it and I see that, I think it's engaging with the earlier synoptic problem with some of you standing here will not taste death. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a lot of late additions to the Gospels that I think are using to try to fix problems. I think one of them is that late ending of Mark, where it mentions that Mary Magdalene saw the resurrected Jesus first. That appears to have been added after John was already out, where we see Mary Magdalene being first. And he's like, oh man, we got a problem here. We got to square this. So they add a little note at the end of Mark to fix it. But here's why I think the explanation on Matthew 16:27 is problematic, because it says, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death. Well, some is never one. You could have said one. Some is always more than one, and it's certainly not all of them, which means we need at least 2 disciples to still be alive. Now, if you're a preterist, maybe you can say, well, listen, multiple disciples were still alive in 70 AD. I think that is the strength of preterism, because it does fix a little bit this notion of Jesus saying there are things happening imminently, and preterism's like, yes, they did happen, just not the way you would ever think.
Yeah, because you're forced as a believer who says Jesus can't be wrong, and you believe his words. It seems the most obvious, straightforward interpretation was a near soon expectation. So what ends up happening is you either have a choice between Jesus, what he said was right, but what happened, my understanding of what it means, how it's supposed to happen, needs to be reinterpreted. Or you can say, I have a correct understanding of what was expected to some degree, a cosmic, absolutely earth-shattering, life-changing event that is supposed to be the peak of all history, with the Messiah coming and all that, which Jews have thought, and Jesus was wrong. So you have a choice as a Christian. Jesus was wrong about this, and I'm right about my understanding of the world, or at least the expectation of how things are supposed to roll out, or the opposite. And as a Christian, it becomes a no-brainer when you're persuaded that they're expecting it soon, that you kind of need to consistently find a way to, Jesus can't be wrong, therefore he was right, it did happen, but how did it happen? I got to make it make sense. And so I'll make words mean whatever the fuck I have to make them mean in order for that to work.
Words can't mean words. I love the fact that at the beginning of the stream you brought up Thessalonians chapter 4, where Jesus comes on the clouds. If you read through the passage, it's very clear that if this happened, there would be no doubt about it. It says, the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven. Remember, Acts 1 says the way he came into heaven, he'll come out of heaven, right? So he's going to descend bodily from heaven. And then it says what? The dead in Christ will rise first, meaning we should see dead bodies rising from the graves. Did anyone report in 70 AD dead bodies rising from the grave and meeting Jesus Christ in the air? If that didn't happen, then this did not come true.
Right. I agree. I think the Acts 1 interpretation that you have, hard to deal with that Greek. Brethren, you see how he just left? In the same manner, he's going to come again. That's pretty strict sounding. We got a member here. Thank you for being a member. John Mullish. Mullish, forgive me if I butchered your last name. Destruction of Pompeii. I have heard scholars, I don't know if you've heard of this. I think that he might be suggesting there's academia that points out there may be hints in the Apocalypse of John of Mount Vesuvius erupting. There may be hints at it. There may even be hints in the Gospel of John, from what I understand. Maybe you can look that up. I don't know. But I don't know off the top of my head. I'm open to the evidence, of course. Always am. I just don't know enough about it to really be able to comment too much. I do know that there is
look into that. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. You ever heard the apologetic they often say is like about the Matthew stuff you brought up earlier with this zombie apocalypse? There's no external witness to this historically, right? So a lot of people doubt it happened. When you look at Pompeii, you'll find that there's not a lot of contemporaneous writers who describe what happened to Pompeii. You only find this stuff later. And so there are apologists who try to use Pompeii and the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii, which is scant. It's not like there's not a lot on it around the time it happened, as like a way of getting out of the wiggle of the problem of what we saw with Jerusalem. And that's so dumb to me because Josephus, like, give me all the writers who are talking about Pompeii. Like, how many people are talking about Pompeii contemporaneous to the period that didn't live in Pompeii? Because there's a huge library I heard there, and that got destroyed. And like, Josephus is writing about Jerusalem. You'd think he'd know if people were coming out of graves.
Yeah. If anyone knew, it'd be Josephus.
You'd think. Anyway, I took us off of full preterism for a second there. Is there anything we didn't discuss that you had that you really wanted to cover?
Not that we didn't cover. I think we covered everything that I had planned to cover. Obviously, there's a million other passages you could bring into this. Almost every prophetic book of the Old Testament kind of contradicts the idea of preterism. But I think people had heard me talk about the Old Testament prophecies ad nauseum.
I like it. No, it's important though that you're nailing and like you're saying, here's what the Old Testament means, and here's what it's saying. Like, of course, you can get into like an example of something you might have, like they're not sure exactly what it means. It can mean this or mean that, but overall, the context is pretty solid that we're dealing with an earthly national identity of people in a geographic land that is so significant that you get stories told where a king from a foreign land, I can't remember the name in the Elisha stories, the king who comes and he's like
takes the soil with him.
Yeah, he says, "Hey, can I take this piece of land with me?" I mean, that's a powerful.
It was Naaman.
Yeah, Naaman. That's powerful.
Isn't it a crazy story? Yeah, because the gods are territorial. That God is the God of Israel. And if the God of Israel does something for you, what do? You take some of that land back with you because now that God is your God. He's tied to that land.
And that's important that when you see a shift away from the land in later writings to make it a heavenly land, I can only think of one plausible, even though it may mishmash with some philosophies like Platonism and other things, but I can only think of one reason why you'd make it in heaven is because nothing took fruition. So you have to make it something else.
When something doesn't come true, you must spiritualize it, because if you look at it for face value, you would have to admit that it's a failure. One of my favorite examples is there was this cult that was popular some time ago in the late 90s, early 2000s called Strong City. They're led by this guy named Wayne Bent. He changed his name to Michael Traverser, though. but he was another one of these Seventh-day Adventist end of the world type prediction guys.
Yeah.
And the day that he predicted the end of the world was going to happen, what they do, they had this large compound. They had a whole march around the compound, blowing horns and everything like that. And there was a news reporter who knew that this was the day that they had predicted because he interviewed some of them prior, and he wasn't allowed on the compound that day, but he drove up and filmed from the outside to see what was going to happen on the last day on Earth. And they all did the same apologetics. Nothing actually happened. And they went immediately into, oh, well, something changed in the spirit. Something's different in the air. Like the excuses immediately.
That's what happened with Leon Festinger in his original book on cognitive dissonance, which is a fantastic read. It's dry compared to this. I was showing you this before. This is When Prophecy Failed, Cognitive Dissonance in the Prophetic Traditions of the Old Testament. This book is a bit dry. It's factual. It's got a lot of great information, but it's dry. That one on Leon Festinger wrote and was involved in that cult. He pretended, and other, I don't know if they're sociologists or what their actual identity is as like scholars, but they infiltrated the UFO cult the night it all was going down, and they had the shindig. They're hanging out. Midnight comes, and they're all waiting still, and they're crying, right? The group said, it's supposed to happen. What's supposed to happen? North America was supposed to be flooded with blood. Everyone was supposed to drown in blood. Well, 4 a.m. come around. They're tired. Time's ticking. And finally she speaks up and she says, guess what? I just got a revelation. Like the UFO, the unidentified flying, Martians spoke to me, and they told me that your group is the reason that no flood came. We saved North America. So
we did it.
They actually, as a quiet group, when Leon was talking about them and how they behaved, they were very quiet. They weren't very outspoken as a group. They weren't very mission orientated. Once the failure happened, they became outspoken. So we should do a case study, and I'm sure there is something there, but the fact that Christianity started to go viral and there was mission to accomplish, here's my opinion. If we grant there's a historical kernel behind some of this, Jesus and the 12 are trying to get Jews. They think the end's going to happen, and all we got to do is get Israel, right? Focus on that. Hint, you will not have gone through all the houses in Israel before the Son of Man comes. It's about to end. The mission never ends. It fails. So a new Jew named Paul comes along and goes, but there's prophecies in Scripture that say the nations have to be gathered in the end too. So they take it a step further. Now he has to go in mission to find the nations to draw them in order to make the end happen. It's like modern evangelicals funding, getting Jews back to Israel in the land so that Jesus comes back. It's kind of that mission-orientated perception.
Yeah, 100%.
I think so.
It's a good parallel.
I love that book. That's a good read. If you want facts, get this, but dude, get your cup of coffee ready. And yeah, anyway. Justin, what can I say, man? You're a great content creator. You're kicking ass. You go in the lion's den and constantly debate and argue, and your patience is God mode compared to me. And I hope people will go subscribe to your YouTube channels, plural. Which is probably the more fun one? Would you say it's the debates channel for them?
Yeah, if you want the debates, just go in YouTube DZ Debates. You'll find me. If you like a lot of various content, educational content and interviews, and also debates, main channel Deconstruction Zone will have it for you. But I do have a debates only channel for people that are in it for the blood sport.
They're here for the blood sport. Is there anything we didn't touch? You really feel like, look, man, we can't not say this about this material.
I think we're good for now, but you know what? Tomorrow, when we're thinking about this, we're going to be like, oh, there's that other thing we should have talked about. But we can always do a follow-up on this. I can already tell there was some Preterist bros in the comments that are going to need, they're going to be, well, what about this? And
yeah. There's always that
follow-up.
Yeah, we didn't really dive into Adam and Eve on camera. That was one of the major hits for me, is the way they interpreted it was Adam, if you eat that fruit that day, that day you will die. And he
Obviously, it's
ate.
got to be a spiritual death.
Yeah, because how could he have ate the fruit but didn't die the same day when God said that day you're going to die?
Right.
He had
Well,
to have.
I think the best way to interpret the passage is just that A, God changed his mind, or B, God forgave them. He relented on the punishment. And that is not like out of line for like an ancient Jew to think
Right.
that God would not carry out his punishment. He doesn't carry out his punishments all the time in the Old Testament. So the idea that God would have not justice but mercy on his people when they sin, I don't think is out of character.
I think it's one of the interesting things is looking to the earlier Adapa myth, where Enki plays the role of deceiving in a sense, and he tells him, "Don't eat when you go to Anu. Don't eat and don't drink because it's poison. It'll kill you."
Right.
Literally. And he goes and he chooses not to when it was actually the food of life and the water of life, which would have gave him immortality. And Anu's like, how the hell Enki tricked you? So the question is it possible that, Adam was tricked by Yahweh in some way?
Well, it certainly can't mean that they became mortal. And spiritual death is meaningless. There's no such thing as spiritual death in the Old Testament because they still had a relationship with Yahweh afterwards, it seems. So it must be referring to a mortal death, but it certainly couldn't have been in the day because they were never immortal to begin with. That's why the tree of life was there. They were eating from the tree of life that allows them to live. That's why in Genesis 3:22, it says that they have to remove them from the garden lest they reach out from the tree of life and live forever. So like they were never going to live forever in the first place without the tree of life. So you can't say that you can fix the interpretation by saying, well, they became mortal that day.
Yeah.
I think, you've got to do something else with it.
Yeah. And I've heard Jewish interpretation saying dying, you shall die. So because of this, eventually going to die. But again, like you said, in order to do that, you just got to kick them out of the garden so they can't keep maintaining that food, which keeps them alive, the tree of life. So there's different ways I know that can be interpreted this, but like the last one is that death doesn't mean death. You know what I mean? It's kind of weird. It's a weird interpretation, the similar weird interpretation like image of God theology. Oh, we're made in the image of God. Well, I mean, image literally means look like. And you get that just 3-4 chapters later in Genesis with being a descendant of someone they describe, I think Adam. He says he's in the image of Adam, meaning he's made to look like Adam as a
same
descendant.
verbiage.
Yeah. So, and the Hebrew, so, or at least you have the Hebrew pretty much wrapped, there's always something to learn, but you know what I mean?
There always is. I'm actually taking modern Hebrew right now so I can converse better with some of the literature written in modern Hebrew. There's a lot of good biblical literature not written in English that I have to get better access to. So you're going to be hearing some new arguments in the future from literature that we don't have in English.
Hey, I'm looking forward to it, man. You're kicking butt, Justin. Keep up the good work, bro. And I hope people go subscribe, check out your channel. You're doing this full time now, and proud of you. It's a lot of work.
Well, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you having me on the channel. We always have a good time together. And I really appreciate what your channel does. I've been watching your channel for a long time. So I'm thrilled that we can actually collaborate and be able to talk about some of these topics, because if you're a Christian or even a deconstructing person or someone who's an atheist and you hear about full preterism for the first time, it could be a little bit bewildering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just to give a shout out to Daniel here. Thank you so much, Daniel de la Noche. My two favorite Bible channels doing a collab must be Christmas or maybe a pagan solstice. By the way, speaking of that, I want to get Neil, my buddy Gnostic Informant, to debate Michael Jones on Christmas.
That'd be great.
Me and Jones are cool again now. Like, we've squashed the beef. You know what I mean?
Oh, good.
Not saying we have to agree, but we're cool.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always good to try and, be like Jesus and forgive, and vice versa. No, seriously, man, I appreciate your time coming on and hanging out with me. I hope we can do this again in the future.
Sure thing. We absolutely will.
Awesome. All right, ladies and gentlemen, go check out Justin's YouTube channel. You got a Patreon too, right?
I do actually have a Patreon now. Yeah, if you find my YouTube channel in my links on YouTube or in my link tree, you'll find a link to my Patreon. And thank you for all of my Patreon supporters. I really love and appreciate you all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.